know, this is organized by Dieter, Eric, Jonas here. There is also Gary that is not here today, but probably next time. And myself, I'm Jean-Christophe. But for the moment I work in Zurich. So the others that organize and that make these meetups happening. Thanks to AdLogix for the host here. Thank you very much. And also Konstantin is here thanks to King Fu, so thank you very much. So Konstantin will present us the delivering software that matters with BDD. Yeah.
Nice, keep an important detail.
Yeah, that's great. That's okay. Yeah, and then we will have the talk done. So I let you know beginning with your talk.
Thanks. Alright, so as you can hear, I have a little trouble with voice, so it doesn't hurt or anything. So if you can't hear something, or like I'm breaking up voice and like I can't hear it myself, feel free to ask. I will repeat it again. Okay? It's not hurting me or anything. It's just stupid voice. Okay? All right. Delivering software that matters. It is BDD talk, but that's what behavior-driven development means for me. A couple of words about who am I. I'm mostly known as BDD evangelist in PHP world. My official position for the last almost 2 years is BDD practice manager at a company called Invika in UK, which is a group of companies including Sensor Labs UK and Session Digital. Essentially, this position means that I'm trying to bridge the gap between businesses and developers, which means I'm kind of somewhere in between business analysis and development, and also means sometimes I'm taking business analysis roles and sometimes I'm writing code, which is kind of fun exercise. It's essentially internal and external coach, helping companies that we're working with directly and the other companies in the world to apply BDD, DDD, and modern software design practices. You might know me more as a creator of BDD frameworks in PHP, such as Behat, Ink, PHP Spec, Prophecy. I also, throughout my career, contributed to Symfony2 and Composer. You can find my name in some source files from time to time. Last year I was contributing to Elephant in the Room podcast, which is a podcast about software design. It was kind of on pause for a year. We're planning to get back to it with Matthias Veras, so keep an eye on this one. Okay, enough of that. What is this talk about? Well, I want to give you a clear idea of what BDD is and how you can apply it in Symfony. I know it's a Symfony meetup, so I will talk about Symfony. But in order to start talking about how you actually technically do BDD, you need to understand what BDD is and why you would use it. So we first will go through an understanding of what BDD, behavior-driven development, is all about. Then we'll talk why you might want to use it and in which kind of projects you might want to use it. Then we'll discuss shortly how you would technically do BDD or apply BDD on your project. And then we'll look how you build Symfony apps using behavior-driven development, essentially. So what is BDD, or behavior-driven development? Well, if you Google for it, the first definition that you will most likely find is the one from Wikipedia. And that definition is essentially the one that Dan Nord contributed back in the days in 2009. Dan Nord always was all about keywords and buzzwords. So as you can imagine, the definition is quite buzzwordy. So official BDD definition is BDD is a second generation, outside-in, pull-based, multiple stakeholder, multiple scale, high automation, agile methodology. That sounds like a nonsense box of buzzwords, but it kind of all makes sense if you go like step by step through these things. So what I will try to do for the next 5-10 minutes is I will try to go through the history of software development really quickly, through the beginnings of Agile and through the beginnings of BDD. And I will try to unpack every single word here, trying to explain what it actually means and hopefully give you a clear idea what is involved in BDD. So if we go to kind of beginnings of software, we will get to the points like this, right? So this is how people were thinking about developing software back in the days, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And the way you were developing software back then, you were basically acknowledging the fact that you can't just go and write code, because software was very expensive and long to build. So you needed to prepare for building software, right? So you needed to capture all the requirements that there are. And for really big projects, it could take up to 9 months. And then after you captured all those requirements, gathered all the things from the stakeholders, you need to analyze them, because some of those requirements aren't actually needed, or some of those requirements you can't actually implement. So you'll spend another 3 months on doing this. And like basically a year just on analyzing your requirements. Then you take all those analyzed requirements, fine-tuned, and you go into the design phase, where you basically start building high-level architecture, where you will have software architect responsible for finding ways how to implement this set of requirements in the software. And then when that is done, you go and you basically spend the rest of the time developing and testing the software, right? So if you've been for a while in software industry, you know this thing, right? And you know the name probably for that. Everybody knows the name for that? What's the name for it?
Waterfall.
Exactly, that's a waterfall. Now, there is, especially with Agile movement, especially in the last 10 years, there is this misconception or kind of push. People hate waterfall, or hating waterfall is kind of cool stuff to do nowadays. Waterfall isn't inherently bad. It's not a bad process to develop software, but it is bad for the most of the software we're building nowadays. And there is a very simple reason for that. And it's because essentially nowadays we're building software that requires us to have really short feedback loops. What is a feedback loop? Feedback loop is whenever on the requirements phase you're saying, I want this feature. In 1970, it was fine to say, I want this feature, and wait for 2 years till this feature is implemented, and chances were high that after 2 years you still want this feature. In the modern world, where like you have new technologies, new things every month, you cannot do these things, right? And probably whenever you're saying, I want this, if you don't get this in a matter of months, you probably will not need it. So a lot of smart people at the beginning of 2000s started to analyze this, at the beginning of 90s actually, started to analyze these patterns, and they discovered that most of the software was failing, software development. And most of the times that was due to the cost of the feedback delay, right? Because most of the cost in the modern software development comes from this idea of the feedback delay. And it's because if you're working in a stable environment, if you're building something very innovative, something new, a single mistake here could cost you 2 years of doing the wrong thing, right? And it gets even worse with every stage. So it's like there is no feedback from requirements to analysis. So if you capture the wrong requirement, guys in analysis phase just need to alleviate this problem somehow, but they can't change requirements because there is no way to communicate with people back then. Even worse than that, even if you had a way to communicate with people in the requirements phase, they will never listen to you because they spent 9 months doing their job, and suddenly you're coming to them and saying like, hey, can you rework this thing because you were wrong? So that was a huge problem and still is a lot of times when you're trying to build a software. And at the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000s, a lot of very smart people in this industry came up with this idea of agile. So agile is nothing else than glorified waterfall shortened into very small iterations. So you essentially have the same phases, right? You have requirements gathering, you have analysis of the requirements, you have design. It's just like we call these phases differently, and instead of like waiting 42 years for this entire waterfall cycle to continue, you have shorter weeks iterations. So you kind of do waterfall, but like in short week iteration sections, right? And there's two very important concepts for that. First of all is you need to be constantly ready for changes. Hence, we change word requirements to user stories, because user stories are more vague by design, so you can change them as you go along. And even more importantly than that, as you can see in the core of the system, there is this thing that starts from the test, goes into the coding, and continues in refactoring. Test-driven development, essentially. Back in the days, it was called extreme programming, still is in some areas. And the reason why it is in the heart of the agile practices is because if you think about it, if you think about delivering software in short iterations and limiting your knowledge to this like 2 weeks delivery spots, you cannot do this kind of things if you're not But there is a huge issue with them. And the issue is people get very, very fixated on the wording. So there is this word testing. And as soon as you start teaching people like test-driven development, they fixate on the word test, and they fixate on those ideas like, how do I test something that I haven't thought about yet? How do I test something that doesn't exist? How do I write tests for an existing system? And you can't, because that was never a purpose. The idea of TDD was use tests, not for testing, but for design purposes. So tests were a way to describe how your system will behave before you even write it. Right? It's a way to provide example of how your objects will communicate before you implement them. So Dan North, who was back in the days working at ThoughtWorks, came up with this very interesting idea of basically changing the wording. So he said, what if instead of saying test-driven development, we'll say behavior-driven development? Hence, replacing word test with something that actually directly connected with the goal of TDD, describing behavior of non-existent thing. And let's rename all those test cases things to the unit examples, right? So you provide an example of how your unit behaves, and you then implement this based on this example. You implement that unit based on that example, and that started clicking with people, right? Suddenly people started realizing it's all about providing an example of what you're planning to do, rather than testing this. And it's very easy to starting to come up with those examples rather than just testing things. But then an interesting thing happened. Then North started sharing these ideas about like renaming things into examples and focusing on examples with people inside ThoughtWorks, with different departments. And Chris Matz, brilliant business analyst in Agile, was working in ThoughtWorks at the same time that Dan was. And they had a very interesting discussion where basically then Chris said, look, this thing that you're doing with your classes, with your objects, where you provide an example of how your object should behave, then you implement this object, and then you check if it fulfills the behavior. That's how we do business analysis in Agile, right? We're asking client to provide us with examples of how they will build the system, and then we use these examples to build the system. That's how we analyze requirements. So what they did, they essentially said, what if there's multiple levels of these examples? What if in addition to unit examples, which operate on the object level, you also have like story examples, which operate like on the client-facing business level? So that's why BDD is multiple stakeholder, right? Because you both address technical and non-technical stakeholders in the system. But then, as soon as they started doing this, as soon as they started implementing, interesting things started to happen. So first of all, when you provide examples of the business needs to developers, suddenly developers start understanding why they're doing what they're doing, why they're writing those lines of code. Who knew? And at some point, they start caring so much that instead of sitting and waiting, given next requirement, they start going to the business and asking, look, I know that you're really interested in this value, in this business aspect. How can I help you? How can I help you to implement this value further? And suddenly this push-based system where everything goes from the top transforms into the pull-based system, where essentially developers ask for examples from the business and ask for new requirements when they're ready. And that's why BDD is pull-based, right? And also, if you look at those two things, it's there's two very clear cycles. There is a communication cycle, and there is an internal cycle, like how you build objects. This is like outside of the system. Your stories and examples of how the system behaves. This is inside of the system, how your units inside behave. That's why BDD is outside in, right? And also, those things are, as I said, system, units. So that's why BDD is also multiple scale, right? It operates using examples at different levels. And in order to support this from the technical perspective, we actually even use different tools at different levels. And that's why whenever you are talking with experienced BDD practitioner in PHP, he will say, I use both BDD and PHP spec, right? Because it also is BDD, high automation practice. Because you want to get these short feedback loops and you want them to help you design things while the quality of your software stays high. So that's why essentially BDD is outside in, pull-based, multiple stakeholders, multiple scale, high automation, right? And yes, it's a second generation Agile methodology because it shifts some things around, like changing push to pull-based, right? So that's why I think this definition is fun and fascinating, but at the same time I know that nobody will, in a sane mind, will remember it. I don't. There is a shorter and more concise way of defining BDD. Lee Skiro, one of the famous BDD practitioners, put it this way. BDD is when you use examples in conversations to illustrate behavior. There is a missing bit here. It's because Lee, for the last couple of years, was focusing primarily on non-technical BDD, and you can do this kind of things where you apply behavior-driven development or discovery of examples on human interactions and team-based strategies without developing software. Whereas classical BDD also should include developing behavior, right? So it's not only about illustrating behavior, it's also about implementing these behaviors in life using software. That's one missing bit. So that's what BDD is. Why would you want to do that? Right? There is a lot of things that BDD does. Why would you want to do it? Why would you want to apply it to your project? Here's a more recent definition of BDD, which kind of clarifies why would you want to do it from Dan North. It describes a cycle of interactions with well-defined outputs resulting in the delivery of working, tested software that matters, right? So that's why I do BDD. That's why most of the people I know doing BDD do BDD. It's because it helps you to deliver software that matters. How does it help you? Well, if we step back a bit and we look at the market, everybody kind of either does Agile right now or brags that they do Agile. And the way Agile works nowadays, or works for people that say they do Agile, is they basically take the pipeline of features, right, which is like continuum. They say, if we implement every feature consequently, one after another, in order to be Agile, what we do is we assume that after implementing first 3 features, there might be change. We might learn something about the business, we might learn something about the market, and we will need to drastically change direction. And we will change direction because that's Agile, right? And then after implementing this next feature, we will also discover that again, we were going in the wrong direction, or maybe we discovered a better way, so we again change direction into another way, right? Into different direction. And you go like that, you build a software for half a year or for a year, and then you end up with Google Buzz. And then you're closing it, right? And if you think that like Google Buzz is alone in this journey of being like very agile, like applying features, trying something new, it's not. So here's a stats from Standish Group, which is like research company that basically analyzes development of the software and sees how the software gets through success rates, or how it is used by people. So here's a percentage of feature usage in enterprise software. 45% of the features delivered to the users. I'm not talking about like percentage of features that never delivered. 45% of the things that delivered are never used by the users. Right? So 45% of the things that you will ever deliver, on average, will never be used. Almost half. And then 19%, rest of 90% will rarely be used. And then 16% will be used sometimes. 13% will be used quite often. And only 7% on average of everything that people deliver is used always. Right? So 7%, that's the company differentiator. And like you deliver only 7% out of everything you did. That's the thing that differentiates you. So on the industry-wide level or wide scale, we essentially deliver waste. That's the truth. Right? We don't call this waste, we call this feature. We call this scope sometimes. But we essentially deliver 93% of features that are not used always. And we kind of want to target this always thing. And now I will start talking about even more controversial things, but they're all based about experience. The interesting thing is, for the last 2 years, I was primarily focused on engaging clients, talking with different clients. And Vika is a huge organization where we have 5-6 clients every 2 months, like onboarding them with their own projects. And the thing that I learned in the last 2 years after talking with these guys, getting to the first engagement, is that despite what you might think about them, despite what they actually say to you when they come, they do not actually care about the scope. When they say like, I want this list of features, here's my list of requirements, they don't actually care about this list of requirements. Even worse than that, when they say like, that's the money that I'm ready to spend, they don't really care about this money that they're like ready to spend. The only thing that all of the clients care about, it's not the scope, it's not the budget, it's their business, right? That's the only reason why they came to you. It's not because they want to implement every single feature out of this huge backlog. It's not because they want to spend exactly this amount of money. It's because they have some specific business need that they want to deliver or support. And what I learned in the last 2 years is that the only reason why we're living in this environment where clients do care about budget and do care about scope, or seem to care, is because we do not care about their business. Right? So that's a coping mechanism. Scope and budget is a coping mechanism. When a client comes to you and says, here's the scope, here's the budget, it's essentially a way to say, look, I have a business need, I have no trust in you. So I just hope that if you implement all of these features, some of them will help me, right? And in this environment, of course, they would want to get as much features as they could for as less money as they could pay. That's the environment we're living, but that's the environment we created because we never care about why we're doing what we're doing. And the interesting thing that I discovered is that as soon as you start talking with them about the business, as soon as you start asking why they're doing what they're doing, where they're going, they forget about budget and scope almost immediately. So as soon as your client comes and says, here's the scope, here's the budget, and you spend some time together with him and you start asking questions like, where do you want to be? What's your business problem? What doesn't work for you? Oh, your conversion rates are not high enough. So that's what you're trying to do with the scope. You're trying to increase your conversion rate. How much? 5%? Okay. What if we try to increase it 10%? You can increase my conversion rate 10%? I don't care about the scope anymore, right? There is this process that we're going with every single client, which we call discovery. And one of the last questions we ask our clients at the discovery is, after identifying what they actually want to achieve, after identifying their business goal, and it's always increasing conversion rate, increasing revenues, or decreasing maintenance cost of the system. The thing that we ask is, okay, if that's your goal, if that's what you want to achieve with our help, what if we deliver that business goal with completely different scope, with completely different set of requirements? What if this application will look completely different from what you have in your head? And 99% of the clients say, I don't care. They don't care. They don't care which features you deliver. The only thing that they care about is the business. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, start talking, right? Start talking with the business in their language, using the language that they can understand and they can relate to. And that language is business examples, right? Start asking them, can you give me an example of how this department will do this thing? Can you give me an example of how this person will operate on the system? Can you give me an example of how your users will change their behavior and pay you more? How are you planning to increase that conversion rate? Essentially, try to deliver software that matters instead of just delivering software. Okay? So that's why you would do BDD. How would you do BDD? The thing that most people don't get when they're just jumping into BDD is that BDD is first and foremost is agile practice. It is agile practice, right? So all of the things stated here are true for BDD, right? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Have a conversation, right? Talk with your business before you start using tools like BHAT, PageSpec. Try to improve the way you interact with your business, and tools will follow. Work in software over comprehensive documentation. Tools like BHAT and methodologies like BDD are supposed to make it easy to write software. If you are using BDD or you're applying tools like BHAT and it makes it harder to write software, either you're doing something wrong or tools that just don't fit your purpose. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, right? That's the mistake that I see a lot. People use scenarios as a commitment with the clients. It's just like, that's exactly what I will deliver. Scenarios are not promises of what you will deliver. They are the way to discover uncertainty or uncover uncertainty. They're the way to communicate and make sure that everyone is on the same page. Responding to change over following a plan. Again, scenario is not a promise. So whenever you describe something as an example or scenario in the Gherkin case, it doesn't mean that it's like it will stay there forever. As soon as there is a need to change, it will need to change together with your requirements. So the most important thing to take away out of this presentation, and I'm not into it, having a conversation is more important than capturing that conversation on paper or in computer. And capturing that conversation on paper or in computer is more important than automating that conversation. So whenever you're thinking about about using tools like BDD, start from the conversation. Let me give you an example. When browsing an article, users should be able to see related articles. Very simple user story. There is 3 very simple questions you can start applying to your stakeholder or product owner whenever you get this user story. Just stand up, go to your client and start asking them, why would anyone want this feature? Who will benefit from it the most? What does it need? What does he need in order to benefit? What does this guy need? Right? So those related articles. So in order to have that cool feature everyone else has, right? That's how you would start it. Like, that's why we want this, because everybody has it. All the competitors have this feature, like, we need it. Well, start asking, it's like, why do competitors have it? Why is it so important? Why would people want it? Why would your users want it? Well, in order to read more interesting articles, we kind of want them to stay more on the website. And in order to do this, we need to provide them a way to to jump over interesting articles or related articles. That's a good value. As a user, again, user is anyone and no one at the same time in the software industry. Everybody is a user. We all use software. And at the same time, users also could have applied limitations. So that's why in Agile it usually is considered anti-pattern to use word user. And you would usually want to describe somebody that is more specific in that particular scenario. So in order to read more interesting articles, who reads more interesting articles? A reader, right? A person that came to your website to read. And that's a very specific, separate role in the system. I need to see related articles that are to the one I'm reading. In order to read more interesting articles, very clear connection both to the interests of the reader and to the interests of the company. You can, like, based on this premise, if this works out, you will sell more ads if you're ads-based business. As a reader, I need to see related articles to the one I'm reading. To read more interesting articles, reader. And you will probably produce a lot more of these things, right? And then the question, which one goes first? How do we prioritize? Which goes into the first sprint, which goes into the second sprint, becomes a simple question to the stakeholder, right? Ask your stakeholder what he needs most first. And you'll say, well, of course, I want people to read more. That's the first thing. But then, as soon as they will start reading more, there will be spam probably, so I want to protect them from spam. And then, I want that also to provide some communication ways. It's like, if they found this article that they want to discuss, I want them to spend more time on the website, so let's provide a comment section on their articles. And that's how you prioritize things. And as soon as you chose the one thing that you want to work on, then you start asking questions. You start asking, can you, in this regard, so reading more interesting articles, related articles to the one I'm reading, can you give me an example of how it will work on the highest possible level, without any UI in mind? Can you give me an example of seeing related articles? So first of all, you will see the article with the same word in the title. Okay, can you give me step-by-step example how it will go? And this is where you go to. Given the context when an event occurs, then the outcome should happen. So, given there is a Symfony Belgium is awesome article, and there is Symfony Belgium schedule article, somewhere in the blog. When I read the Symfony Belgium is awesome article, then the Symfony Belgium schedule should be in the list of related articles. Right? That's a simple example, very straightforward. Everybody can understand it. And that kind of provides you with a starting point to communication. So the next question is, okay, could you provide me with any other case? Is that the only case? It's just like word in the title? What else could it be? Well, we also have a tagging system. Oh. So you would see the same, like the articles that tag the same with the same tag. Yeah. So given there is a Symfony2 is awesome article tagged impressions, and there is a Symfony3 is great article tagged impressions, when I read the Symfony2 is awesome article, then the Symfony3 is great should be in the list of related articles. Again, very simple example, you have clear idea what should be there when you're implementing this feature. And then of course you go to negative examples, not seeing an article with the same word in the title if it is an ignored keyword, right? So we probably want to exclude some keywords. If it's like Symfony blog, maybe all of the titles will include Symfony, so like there's no point in relating them. So there are some tips and tricks you can use in this conversation. The first question you should start from, and the very simple one, can you give me an example? So whenever your business throws some requirement on you or business need, and he says like, we need to implement that thing, ask him, can you give me an example of how it will work? Like, pretend to be stupid. Like, I don't know, like, I have no idea. Can you give me an example? If it's hard for the client, product owner to come up with an example, provide an example for him. So it's like, so, okay, this is how it works, right? So it's like, you're on the home page, you're doing this thing, you're having this outcome. And then you will see that product owner will start correcting you and say, no, that's what I want. So as soon as you're done with your first scenario, which is the hardest one, then you can start asking your questions, like, given as a context, is there a context in which this example wouldn't be true? So that one is very, very easy to use in order to come up with negative cases. So, for example, looking at this scenario, given there is a Symfony Belgium is awesome and Symfony Belgium schedule article. So it's like, in which case this thing wouldn't be true? And that's how it's like, well, if Symfony is reserved keyword, that's how you come up like with the scenarios for edge cases. Is that the only outcome? So that then step, is that the only thing, or there should be some other things happening? Maybe you need to send an email to somebody or like record some stuff in analytics. Does the user has the full control? So that's a very interesting question. It's like, in the cases where your user doesn't have a control over the feature, or doesn't really need feature, it's probably not the user story for him and not the feature for him. Classical example, in order to write comments as a user, or as a commenter, I want to enter CAPTCHA, right? Nobody wants to enter CAPTCHAs ever. And the only reason why we're forced to enter CAPTCHA is because somebody's worried or scared of spammers. Right? So as soon as you have this conversation, you can start building your Symfony applications with BDD. I will provide you 3 simple steps how to build your Symfony application using BDD. And those steps, by the way, are applicable to both existing Symfony application or the greenfields. Exactly same steps. So 3 steps. Step number 1, forget that you're building a Symfony application. Right? I love Symfony. That's a great framework. But I think just because we're so focused on building Symfony applications rather than just building business applications, or rather than just building applications, we sometimes get carried away with why we're building it. We're making like technological decisions. We will use Symfony for that app without even understanding what this app is all about. And I think the problem there is Symfony is a great framework that essentially, to the core, is flexible enough to be added on top of any existing domain or business logic you have, right? You need to have this business logic. Because otherwise what happens is we're starting to add this business logic inside Symfony, And then we're getting into this all the kind of weird conversations like, do you test your controllers? How do you test your controllers? Do you unit test them? Where do you put business logic? Do you put them in models? All those things are happening just because we start from the framework rather than we start from the need. Right? There is no need for Symfony application until the moment in the development of your application where you need to expose it through HTTP. Step number 2, build an application using BDD, right? Without Symfony. And step number 3, use Symfony to help you with integration. Integration with databases, using Doctrine, integration with HTTP. Use Symfony, all the tools that it provides, all the annotations, all the awesome things to expose your application through HTTP. But don't use Symfony to build your application in the first place. So I'll give you a very simple example based on the process that I went through the recent month. So I have this feature. This is an actual feature of the project that I'm working on currently. So I'm working on a new version of behat.org, which is like Behat official website. And one of the features of this website will be to automatically generate documentation for Behat and extensions. So this particular feature describes a case where we automatically generate from Sphinx docs documentation for both Behat 3.0 and 2.5. So in order to help newcomers start using Behat quicker, as a documentation contributor, I want Behat documentation to be published after we release a new version of it. Very straightforward. And then I also use this pattern from time to time. It's not parsed by Behat or by any other tool, just a set of rules. This is a business rules. This is your actual acceptance criteria. So documentation for Behat should be published, and documentation for both versions should be published, for both 2.5 and 3.0. And then we have a very simple set of examples, scenario. Publishing Behat 3.0 documentation. Given Behat, which is a package name, or repository actually, version 3.0 was documented. No, this one is a repository, sorry. So given that package documentation, that version was documented in that repository. Very straightforward. When I release a new version under this repository, then the documentation should have been published, right? And then I have the same thing for if I have both 2.5 and 5.0, which are essentially branches under the same repository. So when I push in both branches, then I should have documentation for both of them updated. And then if the repository doesn't have any documentation in it, then it should not be published, even if we get notified about the release, right? So I've started from describing how this thing should work, and that was actually the first feature in behat.org. I didn't have anything. I didn't even have composer.json, right? That's the only thing that I had. So I put it in the features folder, and I started describing what I want to get to. As soon as I describe this feature, that's the time that I can get into Behat. And as soon as you have this process, you really start understanding what Behat is. And Behat is not an application or a tool to test your business application. It's not a tool to test your framework. It's not a tool to test your integrations. Behat essentially is a tool to test your app against your features, against your examples. So Behat in this case is assert equals, right? So what you're doing with Behat is you're asserting that your application fulfills the examples that you provided in feature files, right? And that essentially allows you to go through the process, which essentially is agile, and BDD practitioners call BDD loops. And it's because you take this pattern, which is inherently agile, and you loop it. Right? So the way it works is you start from the fading, you take your examples, and you treat them as tests, essentially. And you go through test-driven development trying to make them green. So the way it works is like you start from undefined scenario, so you need to provide a test case. You provide a test case fails on your business level, right? But you can't implement system purely on the business level, so you push these things down the road to the object level, where you write an object level test, unit test, which also starts failing. And then maybe there's multiple of this. And You start implementing this, providing these examples for the units, you start implementing these units, and at some point, hopefully, your unit starts passing, which on its own terms goes back to your business, and your scenarios also start passing. So it's like, it's two loops. And then you go to another scenario, and you start from the scratch, right? That's how you implement systems. It's a two loops. You start from the outside, where you use scenarios as a test case. You go step by step, and every time your step fails, you go down the layer to the object level. So let me show you an example of how it will work. So I will just guide you through the first scenario of this feature. So the first thing is you install, it's an empty project, or maybe a project with Symfony if it's legacy hub, or not greenfield hub. So you just install BDD in the dev environment, and then you run BDD-init, which essentially initializes BDD context class where you will put your step definitions. And then you run that first scenario out of the entire feature, and you ask BDD to append snippets, which is like those step definition methods. BDD will automatically put them into the context, so you just need to fill in the methods inside. After this, so it's like two simple commands. After this, when you run BDD for this particular feature, or this particular scenario, you will get a situation like this. Essentially, BDD says, okay, I see that there is this given step in your context, but I have no idea what to do with it because it throws engine exception, right? So you need to tell me what to do. So you go into this context class, and you see this. So given package name, version string was documented in the repo name on time string, right? So package was documented on. So now you just need to write code that represents this step on your object level. So first of all, I will just, like those four things, don't worry much about them. It's basically I'm transforming those strings into the actual domain objects, value objects. So repository, create a new instance of fake repository. Named is a static method call which returns new instance of fake repository. It's just named constructor or static factory. So I create new instance of fake repository. I create new instance of fake package based on the names of both. Then I create new instance of the version, which is package version. And then I create new instance of the date time immutable. And then I, based on what is stated here, package version string was documented, so same repository document package, and I provide all the arguments here. And also for the later use, I'm storing repository onto the context instance. You run this thing, your step fails. And that's how you get into this loop. So you basically has class does not exist, method does not exist, or some permutation of this. So you push this thing down the road, and you start writing unit tests for this in existing classes or methods. And those unit tests start failing. You start operating on the unit level, you fix those unit tests, your unit tests are passing, and that on its own turn, hopefully, makes your step green. And here, hence, you go to the next step, right? Very short process, very fast. So the next step is, when I release this repository of this version. So again, just getting a domain object from the repositories that we saved in the previous step, right? By the name, and then I create a version string, and then I ask release manager, which is a new object that I'm initializing it in constructor. I'm asking it to release new release of this repository and version. And again, I'm getting in the same situation, where class not found, method not found. I'm pushing it to the unit level, I'm writing unit tests, examples how these objects behave. They fail, I make it green, and hopefully by making it green, my step gets green. And 2 out of 3 steps in our scenario green. So the last step is, then project name, version string documentation should have been published. And we have 2 arguments. So essentially now we need to make an assertion that this documentation exists in some object which is documenter. So we create new object in the constructor, which is like documenter, high-level service. And we ask the documenter to find us page with this documentation ID, which is project name plus version string, and of this page ID, right, index. And again, exactly same pattern, right? Step fails, class not found, push it down the road, we implement the classes, and then our scenarios are still failing because even though classes and methods exist, they don't return. Like this thing does not return what we expect it to return. So we do some job on the unit level, trying to make our tests green, and hopefully by making them green, at the point when they're green, that's like our side layer becomes green. And hence we get to our first scenario. And through this process, essentially, you build what's called domain model, right? You build a business logic separated from all the frameworks and stuff in your application. And I ended with something like this. That's my SRC folder. So I have documentation package, GitHub, integration with GitHub, package, release, and Sphinx doc, integration with Sphinx doc builder. And then I have release manager, which is high-level facade. All right? No Symfony here, no doctrine, nothing, right? Pure business logic, pure thing that I care mostly about. And then at some point I was like, now I need to hook it into Symfony. Now I need to use Symfony. The way you hook it is, I created documentation bundle, which sole responsibility is to create those services using the service container definition and use them in the controller. And then the infrastructure basically hooks me into the doctrine, right? And the interesting thing when you do this is you essentially learn that what you care most about, like all your business logic, all the most important things about your application are here, right? They're not here. And what it allows you to do, it allows you to apply shortcuts when you use Symfony. Because all the things that I care about are here, and they're clear, they're clean, in here I can actually do a lot of shortcuts, I can actually do a lot of very nasty things, considered nasty. So my controller will look like this. So I will have like this method, which will actually go to the service container, and I will extend my controller from the base controller. And I will call the base controller methods. And I will do a lot of things like roots in the method, in the annotations. A lot of those things that over the years we were learning not to do, right? And even worse than that, I will never test this controller directly. That might be tested over some smoke tests later on, but I will never deliberately test this guy. And the reason why I will never deliberately test it is because, again, all the things that I really care about are not there. All the things that this thing does is actually proxies calls to the thing that I care about. All the business logic, all the logic lives outside of this method. And from this point on, I don't care if I test this or not. And that actually allows me to do very interesting things down the road. Because I don't care much about this thing, I can use shortcuts. And I can actually replace all my controllers with other framework when another framework becomes cool. Just for fun, I can replace all my controllers and all my doctrine integrations with a Laravel application in a matter of weekend, just to see if it looks more fun, and then switch back to Symfony. And I can do this because most of my business logic is here, not here. And it's not tied to the framework. Now, not being tied to the framework is not the goal. I'm not deliberately trying to separate myself from the framework, but I'm also not tying myself to the framework where I don't need it. There is no need to hook myself into the whole HTTP cycle when all I need is actually to generate documentation. And in most of your cases, when you are talking about things like blog posts, articles, commenting system, related articles, this logic doesn't need to live inside your controllers. It can live outside of that. It can live outside of your application side of things. Okay, so a short recap, what we went through today. We talked about what is behavior-driven development. I hope I kind of clarified some of the things. It's not just doing the weird thing with Gherkin and testing your applications. We discussed why you would want to do behavior-driven development. We discussed how you would do it. Where would you start? You would start from the conversation, and you would start from trying to get these examples out of your business, and then you will write them down, and then you will start using them as tests in your application when you develop it. And we discussed how you will build an application using BDD without Symfony, right? And the interesting thing about this is like, that's why I said like this process is not hooked to the idea of the greenfield. If you already have existing application, find the user story, which adds new feature, and you can go through this process. Even though like in your SRC folder there is already bundles, there is already products, find the feature that you can build separately, and hook it into the Symfony as a separate process. And what you will find out, there is a lot of routine, there is a lot of small things you need to do, as like writing service definition in XML, hooking it into doctrine, writing roots and all this stuff. But all those things, they're just like a small hustle that you need to do as a last step of your application development, not as the first one. I work in the company called Mika, and it's a combination of 4 brands. And we do this for real, for the clients. All of the things that I went through today. And even more than that, if you think that it kind of sounds unrealistic, this process that I went through for Symfony apps, we recently went through a couple of processes where we were building Magento extensions using that approach. And believe me, how Magento is coupled, if you haven't seen Magento, you haven't seen coupled. So you could imagine that you could do things like that. You can do proper design, really high-level software design in a very coupled domains. The question is, why don't you do this in the really decoupled domains like Symfony? And that's basically it for me. Did I overrun a bit?
No, it's good.
Okay, sorry. Do we want questions? Do we have time?
Yeah, you can question.
Questions? Yes.
Is there a best practice to couple your PHP spec to your BDD stories?
You don't couple them really. What you have is
Well, maybe reference is a better word.
you don't need to. The way it happens right now is you run BDD, and from time to time you have this like class not found or method not found. And what you do is like you immediately switch to the PHP spec level where you like PHP spec describe object. And then you go into PHP spec and you write an example of the method that doesn't exist. So I would say without deliberate teaching of both tools about each other, it actually works quite well. It's like you need to get into this like process of switching between 2 tools, but it doesn't take long, and before long enough you will learn that like it kind of flows naturally as you go through it. There are some thinking about how we could integrate these tools further, but I think as a starting point you can just use them, and you will see that like there is out of the box, without knowing about each other, they provide a lot for you. Any more questions?
If we want to learn more about it, where do we start?
Right. It's a good one. So about the high-level process, I will give you 2 links. So about the high-level process, or the whole process of like converting clients, you can read. We wrote a huge document about how we use BDD recently. So in BDD guide, this is where you can learn how we do BDD with our clients. And you could, if you're more into technical side of things, you could look into this repository. So that's essentially an example of me implementing very simple, straightforward feature, which is like adding products to the basket and calculating the basket total cost through this process. So it goes through similar process. There is also, I don't remember the link, but you can search. Marcelo somewhere has, it's Marcelo Duarte. I think it's Pick My Talks. Yeah, so this one is basically us doing the same, where the end goal, the end result is something that you might be interested in. Is essentially a way to build a feature of like creating a personal schedule for the conference, and we actually build it as a Symfony application towards the end. So you can use the end result, which is like completely decoupled the main with a test, with acceptance tests against the main, and then this thing hooked into the Symfony end doctrine working. So yeah,
Perfect.
those two
Nice.
technical examples, and then if you want more business focused thing, learn how to convert your businesses here. And more or less, if you're interested in implementing this and you need a little bit more hand-holding and help, that's essentially, we provide coaching and training services, and we have this service that we sell to other companies where we basically implement BDD for them on the project. So you bring us in, me for example as a coach, and we're basically making sure that starting from the first engagement to the very last engagement with your client, you're actually doing all those things that are explained, that are described here, making it possible for you, essentially. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.